Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I want to welcome you to this webinar on leveraging UN advocacy for gender equality in nationality laws. We're so pleased to have our panelists joining us today from regions all over the world to share some of their experiences advocating for gender equal nationality laws, both at the national level and leveraging UN advocacy opportunities. My name is Catherine Harrington. I'm the campaign manager of the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights, a coalition of national and international organizations, independent activists, UN partner agencies, and academics working together to end gender discrimination in nationality laws. Gender discrimination in nationality laws is something that we still see today in approximately 50 countries around the world. In most of those countries, women lack the equal right to pass citizenship to their non-citizen spouse, whether that spouse is a foreign citizen or a stateless man. In 25 countries, women lack the right to pass citizenship to their children on an equal basis with men. The Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights brought together a small group of some of our expert activists from across our coalition over the course of several months this summer to think together about our experiences using UN advocacy to bolster national campaigns for gender equal nationality laws. This workshop, through the generous support of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, enabled us to really dig deep into thinking about some of the strengths and limitations of UN-related advocacy and some of the lessons learned from these experiences. These series of conversations also resulted in the development of a short guide that's meant to be used by civil society that collects some of these key points from some of our conversations. It's really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of lessons learned around this type of work, but we hope that these tips that we've collected in the guide, which will be launched shortly and shared with you all, will be useful for your work. On a couple logistical notes, just to note, apologies for those technical challenges. I hope that everyone was able to receive the new link for this discussion. We're really pleased to be offering both Arabic and English interpretation, as well as international sign interpretation. And thanks in advance to our fantastic interpreters. So please feel free to use the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen to use the Arabic interpretation if you like. Also, please use the question and answers icon at the bottom of your screen. We'll have a couple different opportunities to take questions from the audience, so please feel free to add your questions there. I'm really excited to have this amazing panel, and we agreed that it was really important to start off this conversation by hearing the testimony of a woman who is herself affected by gender discrimination in nationality laws. I love to invite Myrna to join us on the screen. Thank you, Myrna. Myrna Sabah is a Lebanese woman and activist who has been fighting for the right to pass her citizenship to her children. Myrna, thank you so much for joining us. And I'd love to invite you to share some of your experiences with us here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you all for this wonderful opportunity. You're giving me the chance to participate and talk about my experience as a Lebanese woman who was not able, as you all know, to pass on her nationality to her children, who are treated as foreigners in their mother's country. Like when I decided to marry, I didn't for a second think that the nationality of the person I chose to marry matters, and that marrying a foreigner will have negative consequences on the future of the family that I wanted to start. So I only started realizing that when these negative consequences, when I had my first baby, my son, as in the hospital, they refused to give me like a simple health record because they considered him as a foreigner, and this health record is a privilege for only Lebanese babies who are born from a Lebanese father. But I did not submit to their will. I demanded it, and I told them that he is the son of a Lebanese woman and he has the right to get one too. And I succeeded and I took it. Unfortunately, the success I had at the hospital did not replicate in other fights that I took to fulfill my right of passing on my nationality to my children, which I'm still denied to this moment. So even though I tried to network and worked with many NGOs, including the Nationality campaign in Lebanon, where we advocated and lobbied for the change of this discriminatory nationality law, we did not succeed. Every time the proposal we sent to change the law was put in a drawer and locked in the offices of the parliamentarians. And it was never passed, or even in some cases reviewed. Unlike the proposal to grant the Lebanese nationality to those who were born of Lebanese origin, which was translated into a law right away when it was submitted. Like, so imagine when I see someone who claims that he has Lebanese origin, getting the nationality, and my own children, who has never visited Lebanon, and my own children who were born and raised in Lebanon and feel that Lebanon is their home country, aren't able to get this nationality. My problem is actually double because I was married to a Palestinian refugee, and right away when my children were born, they were granted the refugee status. They are stateless in their mother's country. And this is like when I really, after I think 10 years of my marriage, I decided I have to immigrate for the sake of my children to Canada, because whatever I'm doing in terms of lobbying, advocacy wasn't working. And I knew that my son, for example, if he decided to go into law or medicine, he won't be able to work as a foreigner. Even they can't have any property in Lebanon as well. So I decided to immigrate to Canada for their sake. But so I had to leave my career, which was at its peak, leave my parents, my siblings, and all my friends behind. They forced me to leave Lebanon for the sake of getting the nationality for my children, which I really, till this moment, even though I feel gratitude for Canada, because after 5 years, they gave me and my children the nationality. Like the first actually, the first couple of years of our move were really hard because we had a lot of implications on our mental well-being. I was struggling to find a job at the same level that I had in Lebanon, and I had to start working at a lower level than my qualifications and my experiences. Also, my children did not integrate well in the beginning because they were missing their family, they were missing their friend, they were missing their what they call home, which is Lebanon. So the journey to get the nationality, the Canadian nationality, was tough on us, but we are really grateful that we are Canadians now, and my children at least are not stateless anymore. But I don't want even to think that any Lebanese woman married to a foreigner should suffer from this discriminatory law and should live the pain that I had to live with my children when we had to leave the country. So I think we should have this right to pass on our nationality to our children, just like any Lebanese man. who marries a foreigner, and he is able to pass on his nationality to her, while us as women, we can't pass the nationality to our husband nor to our children. So this is in brief. Like, there are many stories that I want to tell. I'm not sure if I still have some time to share some of them. Catherine, can I still share a couple of stories?
Sure. If you could maybe take 2 minutes, if you think that would give you enough time, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah. So when we were still here, like, I can give an example. There was an exercise where my son needed to draw the flag of his country. So right away, he started drawing the Lebanese flag. And this is where his teacher told him, no, this is not your flag. You have to draw the Palestinian flag. So also, this is like an identity crisis for the children. They don't know who they are. They are in a country that they think is home and they feel is home, but everyone else refuses them and doesn't want them to integrate and feel like they are home. This is another problem that my children face. I want to say that I'm back in Lebanon now because I still feel I need to continue fighting for my right and to help other Lebanese women. We will be able one day, I'm hoping, that we will change the law. And I really want to see my children as Lebanese, where I can pass on my nationality to them. This is why I came. And also because I wanted to be close to my family, and this is what my children wanted. It's unfortunate that we had to go all through this just for the sake of getting a nationality. Thank you all.
Myrna, thank you so much for so generously sharing your story. And you touched on so many of the really pertinent issues of how gender discriminatory nationality laws at their core undermine women's equal citizenship, denying them equal status with men in the family and in society, the wide-ranging rights violations that result from these discriminatory laws, even family separation when you felt like you needed to be abroad living in Canada just to be able to access rights for your children. So thank you so much for sharing your experience. And I think many of these issues that you raised are things that are going to come up in the panel when we think about the different obligations that states have that they've committed themselves to under international human rights law as member states of the United Nations, as signatories of a range of international human rights conventions, and how these discriminatory laws don't just undermine women's equal citizenship, but cause violations of a range of rights pertaining to education, healthcare, freedom of movement, et cetera, the right to a nationality itself. So thank you so much, Myrna. And especially as I know you took time out from actually having jury duty right now, so I know you can't stay with us for the whole time, but you made sure to be able to join us to share your experience. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you again for giving me the chance to share my story. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I would love to invite our first panel for Alicia Wallace, Amal DeChikara, and Bina Ramadan to join us on screen. We will now have a conversation with these fabulous people, and then we'll have some time for a few questions from the audience before we move on to panel 2, so that we have maximum time for this conversation. I'm not going to give detailed bios, but just to say that Amal DeChikara is the co-director and co-founder of the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, a founding steering committee member of the Global Campaign for Equal Nationality Rights. Bina Ramadan is the coordinator of the Malaysian Campaign for Equal Citizenship at Family Frontiers, our really amazing Malaysian coalition member that has just seen so much momentum for reform and really impressive advocacy efforts in Malaysia. And Alicia Wallace, the executive director of Equality Bahamas, are also amazing coalition member in the Bahamas. So please, I'm going to turn it over first to you, Alicia, to get the conversation going.
Thank you, Catherine. I think it was so great to start off with that story from Myrna, and thank you so much for sharing your story. And it really makes us think more deeply about the real experiences that people are having within their own countries. And we can really spend so much time focusing on our national context because there's so much work to be done at home. So my question for Amal, and it's a tough one, is considering what we have to do nationally, why bother working internationally? Like, what is the point of international advocacy?
Thanks, Alicia. That's a really good question, I think, to get this conversation going. And I think also, I fully agree with you that hearing Myrna speak about what her family, she herself as a woman, but also her children and her spouse were put through, simply because the nationality laws in Lebanon treat women as second-class citizens to how they treat men. And it's not just Lebanon, it's the same for 24 other countries in the world and around 50 countries if you look at confer of nationality on spouses. And the topic of our this webinar is on leveraging UN mechanisms. And maybe we need to focus a bit on the raging part of that word, leveraging, because it's actually rage-inducing that in the 21st century, we still endure a situation in which 1/8 of the world's countries maintain such problematic backward laws. And that is, to answer your question maybe in two parts, I would say that firstly, we need to ask ourselves why we do advocacy at all. And for those of us in the human rights space, in the women's rights space, we obviously engage in advocacy because we see a wrong in the world that we want to put right. And we see an injustice that we want to put right. And that injustice is the lived injustice of Myrna and her children, the fact that they had to migrate to another country. And they may count themselves amongst the more fortunate ones because they actually had that option of migrating to another country, whereas many children born in this context don't even have that option before them. And so to get to the second part of your question of why UN level advocacy then, I think it's really important that anyone who's engaged in national advocacy to change laws, to change practices, to change policies, to challenge regressive stereotypes or regressive societal attitudes, your starting point and your ending point has to be about your national context. You are the best placed to figure out the strategies that can and may and should work to try and advance your issue in your country context. And then the question is, does UN level advocacy in any way fit in your toolkit? Is this an additional mechanism or set of mechanisms that you can leverage to apply pressure on your national context, to apply pressure on your political leaders, and to perhaps draw attention to your country and its regressive practices internationally and compel your political leaders and representatives to answer tough questions on the international stage? And if when you ask these questions, the answer is yes, or even perhaps it's maybe, then it's worth considering doing UN level advocacy. But I often see people make the mistake of engaging in UN level advocacy because it's another thing to do, or because there is a sense that the UN is able to deliver above and beyond what in reality the UN actually is able to deliver. So I think it's really important that people get into UN advocacy with their eyes open about the limitations, the frustrations, the delays, the long process of engaging with UN systems, the risks that sometimes are attached when you are identified nationally as someone who is engaging in UN level advocacy, but also to see that there can be advantages of drawing attention to your issue, of maintaining a public record, of strengthening allegiances and alliances with influential people from around the world, of pushing for stronger diplomatic action, and also strengthening solidarity with others in other countries around the world who are engaged in similar struggles. So I think there is a point and there can be a point to UN advocacy, but I also caution that it's really important to not see UN advocacy as a panacea and not to do UN advocacy for the sake of doing it, but rather to think really carefully and strategically about how it can fit within your national advocacy strategy, because that's where real change happens, and how UN can be used to give yourself a little boost in terms of what you're doing nationally. But Alicia, you obviously, I mean, you asked me that question. I could have asked you the very same question because you have so much experience and expertise in engaging with UN systems. So maybe I'd throw the question right back to you and ask you to reflect a little bit in terms of your experience of what you feel the strengths and weaknesses are of the UN system when it comes to engaging with the UN mechanisms for change.
There are so many of both. I think one of the greatest strengths to me within the UN system is having a set of standards to work from and with. So just having these treaty bodies, having the conventions and the declarations, so relevant to what we're doing, of course, is the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which we know as CEDAW, the Convention on the Rights of a Child, or CRC. Knowing those articles inside and out and how they apply to our domestic situations and how they compare and contrast with domestic law is really important. Knowing what our countries have ratified, but they haven't ratified yet, any reservations that they have, give us a good sense of where our governments are, where our states are, and how they're thinking. And we can compare where we are to the sort of standard that's set by the United Nations and call ourselves and our governments, as well as civil society organizations, to come up to that level. And being able to participate in UN systems is really important, because when you're actually there, when you are reading state reports and preparing shadow reports, it really gives you a better look at the gaps. The gaps become a lot clearer, and you're able to see what is and is not being said by the state, as well as the recommendations that these treaty bodies are giving to the state. And for a lot of us, I think the UN systems and these conventions and declarations, we realize on the ground don't translate very well. People don't understand what they are. But if we're paying attention and we see the recommendations, we can actually take them back home, talk to people about them and how they would actually relate to their everyday lives. So these really help us to hold our governments to their commitments, and we can give them constant reminders of what they have committed to, using, for example, stories in the news. You know, all the time there are these little sort of blips that we can connect to some of these conventions to make them make sense for people. The other thing for me is doing some research to see which governments and representatives are allies for us. So, you know, who are the ambassadors, who are serving as consular generals, and what are their positions, and can we build relationships with them to get them to be in conversation with our governments about the commitments that they've made. And then, of course, connecting with other advocates, looking at who else is participating in these review sessions, who else is present at the CEDAW sessions, giving oral statements, who else has submitted shadow reports, and being able to build relationships with people, being able to build coalitions so that we can learn from each other. And these, of course, aren't a part of the UN system, but they're sort of offshoots and ways that we can make the system work for us. And I think that's the way that we need to be thinking about systems that we don't necessarily control, thinking about how we can participate and how we can make them work for us, how we can gain access to these spaces, connect with other people, and learn from each other, create spaces like this one for peer learning, I think is really important.
Thanks, Alicia. That's a really good, rounded, and well considered answer. And I hope that it's been useful for our participants also to hear what you had to say. And I guess the two things that I take from that are one, that you shouldn't treat the UNHCR as, the UN as a monolith. It's lots of different agencies, lots of different experts, lots of different bodies, and it's important to know how to engage with each of them. And secondly, this takes time, it takes work, but also there are people, organizations, institutions that specialize in this, and the Global Campaign is one such entity. So for anyone who's interested in engaging in UN level advocacy on gender discrimination in nationality laws, I would say the Global Campaign is a go-to place. And the guide on leveraging UN advocacy is a really good starting point also if you're interested in that. Bina, maybe just to draw you into the conversation, as Catherine mentioned in her introduction, you've had some remarkable advocacy successes within Malaysia. So I guess it'll be really good to hear your thoughts, having made so much progress in your national advocacy, what you honestly feel about UN level advocacy in terms of how relevant and how integral your UN advocacy has been to your national successes.
Thank you, Amal. And both you and Alicia have so clearly stated your stand and given people not just a rosy picture, but some of also the limitations. And so with us at Family Frontiers, we use the multi-dimensional approach to our advocacy in law and policy reform, and we focus on the UN mechanisms because the Malaysian government, similar to other governments, takes pride in their international standing and reputation. And so we did and we do utilize in various multiple UN mechanisms to protect and advance the rights of our marginalized communities. And some of the things which are ignored nationally actually can be highlighted internationally via the treaties and the other UN processes. It's let me give you some real life examples. When Malaysia actually acceded to CEDAW in 1995, but it has been very slow at submitting state reports. So there was one in 2006 and 2018 and a large gap in between. So what did civil society, how did civil society react to that? And they had an alternative report. And we used this report as an advocacy tool to advance and promote the rights of women. So irrespective whether the state or the state actually submitted its report, the civil society went ahead with its status report. And when we participated, we were a small organization, participated in 2018, and there were lots of opportunities during the pre-session and the review to advocate and amplify human rights, women's rights violations, and groups. There were also groups who went state to state, engaging with communities, informing them about the CEDAW process and the women's right to equality and non-discrimination. Some of them even went out to rural areas, spreading the word. So I think it kind of reached all levels in Malaysia. And because of this various activities that are there that these treaty bodies and UN mechanisms offer, that it increases the audience, it increases the breadth of our advocacy. Actually, we also use this in Parliament. So when the CEDAW committee has given us recommendations, we actually kind of keep repeating some of the questions in Parliament to the government, to ask them to make them accountable and let them know that we are monitoring their obligations as well. So, and with all of this, our nationality, our citizenship, the unequal citizenship law has garnered a lot of traction. Partly also because of the national advocacy, but it combines and cascades along with the UN processes. But let me also tell you that during the UPR process, it gives us so many various opportunities, pre-review, post-review, midterm review, to engage with various stakeholders, to also not just nationally, but also internationally. And in 2014, there was there was a lot of backlash we received from state and non-state actors for participating in the UPR process. It was a difficult time for many of us human rights defenders. But on the flip side, this actually gave the Malaysian public an in-depth insight on the importance of the UPR process. And then comes the fun part of the review, where we try to engage communities, diplomats, academicians, civil societies. We hold watch parties of the review process, where we have our allies coming together to view these live proceedings. The media is invited so that, you know, this review is really fully well covered and reported. And so for those of us who cannot go to the UN comes to us. And yeah, so I think it works to kind of solidify and cement the national work that we are doing. Although it may seem daunting to some, I mean, with a basic understanding of human rights systems and processes, we can participate in this form of international human rights advocacy and successfully use some of these mechanisms for promoting nationality rights in our countries. Thank you. And now I have a question for Alicia. Alicia, let's continue this conversation and ask you to demystify the UN and its jargon and committees and technicalities for national audiences.
Thank you, Bina, for your question, and also for sharing about Family Frontiers. I think the work that's been done in Malaysia has been amazing. And we, of course, have a similar situation here in the Bahamas. So we're totally paying attention to Family Frontiers and learning from you. But to your question about the UN and it just being sort of this mystical, theoretical thing that really scares people on the ground, it's sort of been a barrier of sorts for us in the Bahamas, and something that Equality Bahamas has realized that we really need to focus on. People feel like the United Nations is this powerful body that's trying to steal our sovereignty, right? So I think we have a lot of work to do in helping people to understand what it really is, what these conventions are for, and that our states are participating voluntarily, that they haven't been forced to participate. But talking about this doesn't mean much if people still don't understand the conventions and the declarations. And we saw in our exercise to attempt to do constitutional reform through a referendum that it was very difficult to try to get people on board with our cause while trying to teach them about what CEDAW means and those two articles that are relevant to the changes that we're trying to make in the Constitution. So we didn't get to pass the two constitutional amendment bills, but in the interim, we are focusing on ensuring that people have a better understanding of different conventions. So while an issue isn't up for discussion, we're doing solid education on the United Nations on some of these conventions and connecting the human rights language of the United Nations with people's experiences and the usefulness of domestic legislation. So as I mentioned earlier, talking to Amal, it's really important that we make the connections when we see things pop up in the news. We're connecting these news stories and saying, oh, this is an issue that everyone cares about. Let me tell you how this is related to CEDAW. Let's talk about what was said to the state in the UPR process and how we haven't implemented it and how implementation would prevent horrible stories like this from coming up and happening over and over again. So really working on the ground to educate people, but also to get them to join us, mobilizing people to create the political will that we need to see the changes in our state's activities. And back to you, Bina. How do, in terms of mobilizing people, but also working within these systems, how do coalitions work, or do they work? Do they work, or are they just hard work?
Good question. And I'm still trying to figure out that answer. But yeah, it's a lot of hard work because a lot of our time is invested in coalition work. And it ranges from contributing to reports, advocacies, and stakeholder meetings. And that being said, we actually participate in a lot of national and global coalitions, and we have benefited from some of them. And a lot of them are basically to do with UN mechanisms. Like we have a large CSO, civil society group of for the UPR process, and there are about 50 organizations there. And with CDAW, CRC, and the SDG processes. So apart from being in these coalitions and collaborating with our associates, it also gives an opportunity for us to advocate on a particular issue, which also enables us initially when we first started off. We got some capacity building trainings and understanding on UN and treaty bodies because we were fairly new and we weren't, very strong at it. It also gave us that broad-based support and allowed us to make connections and prepare for the reviews with an advocacy and pooling of financial resources. We actually had barely any resources. So all this together actually strengthened us as an organization, strengthened us to build for the advocacy that was to come. And we had, things that we couldn't do on our own, we were able to do via the coalition. So huge briefings were organized within Parliament, briefings of the diplomatic community, press conferences, that if we were to do it independently, we wouldn't have had this depth or the width. So, and it continues throughout the year because there are activities post, like currently right now, our last review for UPR was 2018, but we are currently working with the government. We have meetings. They still treat us with a bit of, there's distance there between government and NGOs, but nevertheless, this is an entry point for us to work on the issue. And similarly, with the CEDAW advocacy group, we had huge launch, and we couldn't have got this kind of exposure if we were alone. But our issue gets covered when we work in a coalition. Also, that we have a huge number of stakeholders, diplomats, think tanks, academicians, government agencies who come there and they can get the whole range of issues in one sitting. And this is quite important as well for the greater visibility of our organization, for our issue. That gets amplified when we are in these coalitions. For example, being on the Joint Action Group for Gender Equality, it gives us leverage and spaces to actually dialogue with ministries, take part in the policy-making process. We are with also some international coalitions and who are very supportive, and otherwise it would have been difficult for us to actually get to know what's going on internationally. I think this webinar is actually an outcome of a sustainable coalition. This is coalition building, and we're working on it. And another coalition that we are in is the CSF consortium, where it is for the COVID emergency of the statelessness fund, and we get connected there on that group with UN agents. And that's thanks to Amal and his team, who's doing brilliant work in getting us connected with UN agencies, gives us experience with high-level meetings and forums, and also allows us to hear other countries' best practices. And on this coalition, Alicia, when you first spoke about Bahamas, I actually was so confused. I was thinking, oh, it sounds so much like Malaysia. And we didn't realize before being in that coalition that there were other countries who have really so similar similar issues. It's just a matter of geographical location, but we are having the same discriminations. We on the ground. So being a member of a coalition can lead to many positive outcomes. And I do hope that being in this global campaign coalition will help in expanding the bandwidth of opportunities for multi-country collaboration to advance and promote equality of women and their families, and to put an end to gender discrimination in nationality laws. And now, Amal, I have a question for you. And you are an expert actually at this. So how do you deal with situations when countries speak internationally as champions of rights, but continue to maintain reservations to fundamental treaty provisions, or continue to maintain discriminatory legal structures domestically? Amal, and this one is for you, but I do remember you really clearly actually explained some of this to us, but let the audience hear you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bina. And I mean, it's a really challenging question. And I think, the guide that Catherine just shared with everyone on the chat, which has been launched today, it actually goes into this question about reservations. And it clarifies that even though under the Vienna Convention, states have the capacity and the right to enter into reservations, the fact of entering into reservation doesn't make that reservation valid under international law. And this is something that's often glossed over by states. And this, I think, goes back to the question of bad faith engagement. And I think many of us who engage in national spaces, we see this duplicitous nature of state representatives saying something nationally and something very different internationally. It goes to what Alicia said about how UN bodies and their role and their position is kind of misinterpreted, often intentionally, by governments in order to give their population a feeling that this is the UN interfering in internal affairs and national sovereignty. And it's really important, particularly for national actors, to call this out and to be strong. And the more expertise you have in international law, in how different treaty bodies and UN mechanisms work, the stronger your footing to call this out. And to push states to actually answer questions rather than gaslighting you and kind of coming up with like changing the direction of the discourse. I'll just end here on one final point, and that's that when you're doing international advocacy, when you're doing national advocacy, you need to win the argument in the specialist arenas, be it the courts nationally or the UN mechanisms, but you also need to win the argument in the public square. And what often happens to us is we win the argument in the specialist arenas, but governments then sometimes misrepresent what happened in those specialist arenas, and they twist it, and what happens then in the public arena is very different, and we lose those arguments. And that's where I think a lot of us have to get better, get more savvy, and get more political in how we also take our issues forward. So I apologize to the second panel. I think we've gone on for perhaps a little longer than we should have, but it's been a really interesting conversation. So thank you all for being so kind of generous with your expertise. And let me hand back to Catherine to take us from here.
Thank you. Thanks, Amal, Alicia, and Bina. Yes, there's so much that we didn't want to cut you all off with so many important points, but I think in the name of time, I do see one question from Miriam. And Miriam, if you will allow us, I would love to now, I think, condense all of the questions at the end after the second panel. So please, I'm encouraging others to feel free to add your questions to the Q&A. And many thanks to panel one for a great discussion. And I'd like to now invite our panel two, Subin Malmi, Melinda Charlini, and Karima Chibu to join us all here on video. And again, without taking too much time for in-depth bios to share, just to say that Subin Malmi is the Executive Director of Nationality for All, which is a regional network working to end statelessness and promote equal nationality rights. One of our steering committee members, very pleased to have you here, Subin. Melina Charlini is also with Family Frontiers in Malaysia and has been doing amazing advocacy in that campaign there. So Melinda, wonderful to have you. And Karima Chibu is the manager of the Lebanese campaign for women's equal nationality rights. My nationality is a right for me and my family, and leads that campaign through her work with the Collective for Research and Training on Development Action in Lebanon. So turning the floor over to you all to get the conversation going.
Thank you, Catherine. If I may, I think I'll probably begin the panel discussion. I've had this opportunity to learn more about the amazing work of Karima and Melinda, and I've been very impressed with, all of the work that you've done. So my first question is to Karima. Given the amazing work that the Lebanese campaign has done, where you've worked closely with the affected persons and do your best to sort of put their voices in front and at the center of your advocacy, what recommendations or what suggestions would you have to other organizations who are sort of trying to do the same work, and also trying to protect their well-being at the same time as well?
Hello everybody, thank you Sabine. سوف أتكلم بالعربي. I will speak in Arabic.
I will speak in Arabic, and I will answer your question. I will answer your very important question for us that we previously discussed in our meetings. It was a challenge, one of the biggest challenge in my life, which is engaging the affected persons from the discriminatory laws in Lebanon. The basic work was actually, and the result of that work, it was distinguished. We have worked to integrate women first, then their husbands and their children, male and females. And I was keen that the engagement, not only for women, because they are not only because we are asking for their rights, but this is to express the equality. So for us, they have the right. It was very important. That's why it was very important for them to be engaged during the activities. One of the excellent things that we have done is capacity building, like the stake or the affected person stake capacity building, and how to deliver their messages and how to express this demand and this right, and engage them in not only in the activities, but or protesting or demonstration, but also to prepare for the protest, in writing the slogans, in planning, in holding those banners, as well as in webinars. As you noticed, Mrs. Mirna testified about, or like spoke about her stories. So we would like to see women to express their, or to talk about their experience. And also they should be part in our visits to the decision makers. Because not only us activists in this field, we have to raise these issues to decision maker, but also the affected women and their families, they should be part with the communication process with the decision makers. I would also like to speak about when we hold some activities in the universities with the students. It was very important that we don't only talk about theory or talk about law or to explore or to explain where are the discrimination, but we also brought women and children to express, not only to talk, not only as a testimony, so other people can see that discrimination on the ground, like in reality. We also maintain to give them advisory, legal advisory. So when there is any problem that faced by women and their families, and we know that that law create problems for their rights. So we were keen to follow it legally, and to preserve the confidentiality of the affected person or affected people. As Sabine also asked me, how can I share with other organizations? We actually established a steering committee of affected people. So when we get any problem on the hotline from any woman, we transform this issue into a public issue. So we make it like an issue of public opinion, and we support her, and then we move on the ground. And hopefully we can continue. I don't want to take much of time. Thank you so much. I also would like to ask a question for my colleagues. I'm sorry, my connection is a bit bad in Lebanon. So I will ask Melinda.
I think we've lost Karima there. So maybe I can, if I may, maybe I can ask a question to Melinda. I think something that Karima was alluding to as well, that considering gender discrimination, nationality law impact many affected people and people with different certain characteristics. I mean, as certain people with different characteristics. Can you talk a bit more about the different identities at play? I mean, the intersectionality of different identities, and if and its intersectional approach is important to be applied while engaging with UN level advocacy.
Really special to me because I do identify as an intersectional feminist. So I definitely do agree that it's very important in our work that we take an intersectional approach because it acknowledges that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and oppression. and that various identities held by different individuals can interact differently to either further marginalize or privilege this individual. And like Karima was speaking earlier on the importance of including impacted people in the advocacy or having impacted people lead the advocacy, at Family Frontiers as well, we really prioritize building and nurturing the network of impacted Malaysian mothers, some of whom are here with us today in the audience as well. And I guess being able to look at the lived realities, we are able to really understand how different circumstances that these mothers are in affect them differently. And I think it's also about understanding the histories of this violence and systematic discrimination that have created deep inequalities that disadvantage women, and realizing that these impacts actually extend across generations. But this has also opened up a lot of opportunities for us for conversations and engagements, including the ability to utilize various different UN advocacy mechanisms. So I guess with nationality being such a niche issue and considering we're a fairly small organization, we've had to grab every opportunity that comes in our way to highlight the issue of gender discriminatory citizenship laws in Malaysia. And especially before the case filed by Family Frontiers, because the case obviously enabled the conversation to become a national one. But prior to that, we've had to really find a way to connect discriminatory citizenship laws with various issues. For example, when the UN Special Rapporteurs make a visit to Malaysia, I remember when Bina was single-handedly taking on the campaign, she used to, make it a point to attend these meetings in order to make the connection between the issues that special rapporteurs were addressing and the relationship between those issues and discriminatory nationality laws. And I guess this was how we were able to incorporate the issue of Malaysian binational families in the report on poverty by Mr. Philip Alston as well. And personally as well, I saw the same when we attended discussions at the Beijing Plus 25 Asia Pacific Review, when we were able to incorporate the issue of gender discriminatory nationality laws as well as statelessness into the TSO report as well as the Young Feminist report. But like as Bina mentioned earlier as well, we do engage a lot with the CEDAW mechanism as well as CRC, as well as UPR and SDGs. Recently as well, we were involved with the voluntary national review by the government on the SDGs as well. But I guess apart from this, apart from just looking at identities and how it intersects with nationality rights, we also look at how gender discriminatory nationality laws intersect with other issues. For example, like I mentioned earlier with poverty, but a very stark intersection we've been able to recently really explore further was actually the intersection between gender discriminatory nationality laws and gender-based violence. Because the connection, I guess when you look at it on the surface, it doesn't seem very straightforward. But actually having looked at lived realities and really exploring the issue on a more closer context, we were able to see, especially those in toxic marriages, single mothers, how they are further put into vulnerable and precarious situations as a result of discriminatory nationality laws. So I guess it was really important for us to make that connection. And because many people didn't understand the issue, we actually collaborated with an organization that particularly works on gender-based violence to start conversations on this. And it was very eye-opening for many because they wouldn't have seen the connection at all. So I guess this is why it's really important for us to take an intersectional approach. One, looking at different identities, but two, also looking at how various issues are related to gender discriminatory nationality laws, starting from racism to xenophobia, which are really entrenched in our societies and in countries such as Malaysia. So it is definitely really crucial. And I would really vouch that it does open up a lot of opportunities for engagement and advocacy. Yeah. On that note, Subin, since I also spoke about how in Malaysia, as well as Karima spoke earlier on how we really put affected persons on the forefront and get them to lead the campaign, I think with NFA as well, as a regional organization, you also prioritize working with grassroots organizations and affected persons. So I was just trying to understand how NFA manages expectations with affected persons or grassroots organizations when engaging them to participate in UN advocacy? I guess not just sugarcoating the process, but also realistically putting it forward to these groups.
Thank you, Melinda, for this question, and thank you for your amazing answer to the question as well. I think the intersectional approach and sort of looking at gender discrimination from so many different lenses and from different identity groups is so important, and which brings to the power differential between different groups and different organizations as well. And this is something that NFA tries to be mindful of, the different power differentials or power relations at play between different organizations. And as a regional organization, I think it is so important to manage expectations. So thank you again for asking this question, and something that we've been sort of thinking of and brainstorming for a really long time. I don't think there's a really, I mean the best way to, there's a formula to do that, but it is about listening more as a regional organization, listening more to grassroots organizations, listening more to affected persons, trying to have as much engagements and consultations with affected persons and grassroots organizations without exploiting their emotional labor, understanding that when they are talking about their issues, they are they may be reliving their traumatic incidents, and we don't want to do that as an organization. So in many ways trying to put the onus on us to do our homework, to do prior research, but also sort of always respect the agency and the authority of the grassroots organization. And also want to mention something that was discussed in the previous panel as well. When engaging with UN level advocacy, it is so important to be honest and transparent about the strengths and limitations of UN level advocacy, and that communication needs to be had with the grassroots organizations as well as the affected persons. Extremely important to and to sort of be on the same page regarding what can be realistically achieved through UN level advocacy, and not just sort of jump into the bandwagon because other organizations are doing it or because that's the mandate, but being but being in a position where we don't overpromise as a regional organization, and always keep the expectations realistic. And NFA is a partner-driven organization. We always say the terms bottom-up, participatory, where what we're trying to do is we're trying to listen more and ensure that any UN level advocacy that we do is complementary to the national advocacy and adds value to the national advocacy. The only instances where we try to use more discretion is where where the activists or the grassroots organizations are putting themselves at some risk of reprisal or sort of security risk. This is where we use our authority or discretion a bit more, where we don't want to be in a position where our work leads to such risks or security concerns. And this is where we take a step back, or we take a step front actually, and step ahead, and then have conversations on whether this might not be the best way to approach this issue. But for NFA, I think largely it is about listening. It is about reflecting our work and sort of trying to adopt this bottom-up approach. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Sabin. And I think we're able to see that as well when we work with NFA, that you really give us the space and you transfer the autonomy back to grassroots or national organizations to kind of inform the strategies and implement projects or advocacy campaigns. So thank you for that. I guess, Karima, going back to you, I hope your internet connection's okay now. Building on your previous answer as well, I wanted to ask you if you could talk a bit more about how your work with the impacted persons has been able to inform your UN-related advocacy.
Shukran, Sabine and Melinda.
Thank you so much, Sabine and Melinda. Working with affected persons was in the first place a guidance for us as activists and civil society organizations that works on this matter, they were guiding us, because we were able to know all the obstacles and the violations that are taking place with the affected person or with the affected people, because we were monitoring and we were listening to the complaints more closely, not only about the laws and that is issued after each problem. So the affected people, when they were providing us with any problem or violation that they are facing, we directly read the law and then check for the alternatives, or what is the thing that can ease or like eliminate those violations. So when any decision is taken, the application of this decision is so different on the ground. This is just to say that that was really informing for us. You know that we always need to submit shadow report to the United Nations, and those shadow reports have sections about recommendations and diagnosis of the problems and what are the recommendations to eliminate this discrimination. And that was very cool. And we were supporting these demands with testimonies. So when we were requesting any demand, we were supporting it with a testimony, because we were observing on the ground and listening to the affected people. And those testimonies that we recorded on like short movies or through writings or graphics. It was all like a tank of these of information for us to lobby in order to change these discriminatory laws. Thank you very much. I would like to ask a question for my colleague Sabine.
Thank you so much, Karima.
Sabine, maybe, oh, sorry. I was going to say, if her internet, it seems like there are some problems, maybe I could jump in and ask you a question, because I think you touched on a little bit this question of the potential for backlash with UN-related advocacy and national level advocacy as well, but the particular risk when bringing up these issues at the international level through the UN, and also, you know, relatedly, security concerns and reprisals that human rights defenders and affected persons may face. So could you talk a little bit about, you know, in your experience, how to best try to minimize these risks?
Thank you, Karima, and thank you, Catherine. I'm glad that we're discussing, you know, potential security risks and backlash while we're discussing how to leverage UN advocacy, because this is, I think, in many ways largely overlooked, but I strongly believe that this probably should be the starting point when assessing the potential costs and benefits of engaging in UN advocacy. Because, like I said, I think NFA as a regional organization where we have this bottom-up participatory approach, we listen to organizations, but we don't want to put any of the activists or organizations or anyone associated with the movement or the cause in any sort of harm or risk. And this is where I think regional organizations maybe can take a bigger role and put the onus on themselves to maybe, because many of the grassroots organizations are extremely stretched, they have a lot on their plate, and this is where maybe the risk assessment and the necessary training that can be provided to the activists or organization to sort of assess the risks and mitigate the risk can be done by regional or international organizations. There are quite a few organizations that have the expertise of providing such courses. Like I think of Frontline Defenders being one of them, and I'm sure there are like many local organizations or national organizations that provide amazing, resources or support or any form of assistance in case there are reprisals, or also to just assess the potential risks and benefits, risks and concerns that are there. And I also want to bring up another issue that came up in the workshop, and we discussed this a lot, and a lot of participants share this as well, where in countries where there's freedom of expression or freedom of speech and association is restricted, it becomes even more important to engage in UN advocacy, and sometimes that is the only option. That's the only way they can sort of raise voice in against the oppressive system or against the gender discriminatory nationality law. And this is where activists who are who reside outside the country can play a larger role. Where, and again, considering that would not put their families, immediate families, or anyone at their home country at any form of risk, maybe they can sort of play a bigger role in sort of raising those issues. And also the international actors, international organizations can provide the necessary support to the activists as well accordingly. And I think, and I just want to repeat something that I shared earlier, is putting the onus as international regional organizations on us to take this additional responsibility that none of our UN-related advocacy work would put any harm or any risk or on the local activists or organizations is so important. But I'll probably end at that. There, and any other colleagues, feel free to chime in later on if you can recommend any other organizations that can provide such resources or such courses or any training that can help grassroots organizations make preparations to avoid such risks. Okay, on that note, I have a question to Melinda. I had the opportunity to ask Karima about their amazing work. Now I'm going to take this opportunity to ask Melinda about the recent momentum that the movement in Malaysia has gained, and it has been, a successful campaign. So I think it'll be very beneficial for all the participants to also learn how, or if the UN advocacy has, fed into or contributed to the Malaysian campaign, and what opportunities were presented through the advocacy, or if there were any challenges presented. I think Bina alluded to some challenges as well. So if you could talk about that, that would be very helpful.
Filed a case at the Kuala Lumpur High Court to seek a declaration that the current provision that remains silent on the rights of Malaysian mothers to pass on their citizenship to their overseas born children is to be read harmoniously with the article in the Federal Constitution that guarantees fundamental liberties and also prohibits gender discrimination. And the High Court ruled in our favor and made a decision that Malaysian women would be given equal rights to confer automatic citizenship on their overseas born children. But the government has since appealed the decision. But in the advocacy for our case, and the case itself, we did cite CEDAW and CRC that Malaysia's to highlight Malaysia's obligations to the principles of gender equality and also taking into consideration the best interests of children. But of course, earlier, like the first panel spoke about reservations, we do have reservations in place for nationality. But despite that, we did emphasize on the need for Malaysia to respect and uphold the spirit of these conventions upon ratification. So in the process, we also did cite some successful cases in other countries where the courts have upheld the spirit of CRC in protecting the best interests of children. Because of course, the whole premise of our case was on gender equality. So it was very fitting for us to use CEDAW in advocacy as well. During that process, we did kind of preempt the government's decision to appeal. So we did, even before the government appealing, start a campaign to call on the government not to appeal. And prior to that, we did send a submission to the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls. And this actually led to the working group sending a communication to our government right before that appeal period, requesting the government to clarify on whether they had intentions to appeal, and also asking for clarification on their intent to enforce the High Court ruling, as well as plans to revise national legislation to reflect the High Court ruling. So I guess that was like a really timely communication that had come to the government, and also one of the ways that we tried to utilize UN advocacy mechanisms at that point in time. We've also been having conversations with the UN country team in Malaysia, and following the court decision and the government's move to appeal the decision, agencies such as UNFPA Malaysia have publicly shown their support for the cause. We've had, of course, conversations with other UN agencies as well, but we hope that other UN agencies in Malaysia will follow suit and mobilize the government to uphold gender equal citizenship laws and push them to amend the constitution. But I just want to quickly, before we end as well, to highlight a new opportunity that was presented to us as well, because Malaysia was actually bidding for a seat on the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council. And we utilized this move to actually call on the government for action towards gender equality nationally. Malaysia has since won the seat, and it's definitely an interesting time with good opportunities for engagement. So they've made really strong pledges during its bids, also including, pushing for gender equality nationally. So I guess that presents a good opportunity for us to utilize that to call for accountability and necessary reforms in the country. Yeah, so these were some, I guess, when we're talking about reason advocacy, these were some of the UN advocacy mechanisms that we've engaged with. I hope that answers your question, Subin.
Thank you.
Yeah, it does. Sorry.
No, please do. Good.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it does, and you answered it so elegantly. Thank you so much.
And thanks to all of you on panel 2, and especially thanks to Melinda and Dina and our colleagues from Malaysia and East Asia that are still joining us now. It is approaching 11 p.m. your time, so I really appreciate everyone's participation at this late hour. So though we have about 10 minutes left in our scheduled time, and perhaps we'll steal a little extra 5 minutes after our proposed end time, I want to invite our panelists from panel 1 to also join us on screen now, so we can discuss a few questions from the audience. And I think I would love to start with Subin. Actually, I'll turn back to you. There's a question from the audience that since Nepal has not passed a bill relating to the Citizenship Act that could guarantee a citizenship certificate to a child from their mothers on the basis of their mother's citizenship, how can non-state actors pressure the government to have this citizenship bill passed?
I think before answering this question, just a bit of background on Nepal. So after we had a new constitution in 2015 and had new provisions on citizenship in the constitution. The existing Citizenship Act has not been amended to make it sort of consistent or to adapt to the changes of the new constitution. And the bill, this amendment bill, has been stuck for the last 6 years now. So I think I don't agree that this would guarantee a citizenship certificate of a child from his or her mother's identity. The constitution itself is discriminatory, and as long as the constitution is discriminatory, the amendment bill or the amendment bill can only make certain procedural barriers. We can make sort of easier to address certain procedural barriers, but it cannot still guarantee equal citizenship right through the mother. The one controversial or contentious issue is that the Constitution allows citizenship of children whose mother is a Nepali, and as the father cannot be traced. Then this has been the biggest issue of the new amendment bill, where this amendment bill now clarifies what it means for the father not to be traced. And the proposed provision in the Amendment Act is extremely problematic. That punishes the mother and the applicant if the statement proves to be wrong. So the existing amendment bill is extremely problematic, requires more intervention. And to answer your question on how can non-state actors pressurize the government and have the bill passed, like I said, the bill in its current state should not be passed. I think there needs to be certain amendments. It needs to be more progressive, needs to be more inclusive, and should not be drafted in a way that would punish women or mothers. And I think the civil society as well as the government should also think about or have conversation on amending the constitutional provisions as well. And thank you so much for asking this question. I forgot to thank you.
Sure. And the next question, I think I'd like to turn to maybe ask Amal and Bina. Maybe you can respond to this from both of your experiences. Amal, obviously working in a number of different contexts, and Bina, most recently, you've had this issue come up very concretely in Malaysia. So the question is, how can civil society push governments to achieve gender equal nationality laws, particularly when the government frames such reforms as being linked to the security of the country, and that being a reason why they cannot or are not willing to support these reforms. So maybe, Amal, you could say a few words based on your kind of general experience with this issue, and then I know, Bina, this has come up most recently in Malaysia.
Thanks, Catherine. And I mean, this is actually one of a few kind of recurring arguments. It's almost as if the countries that maintain gender discriminatory nationality laws strategize with each other as to which arguments they're going to make. And I think this also goes back to what we were saying in the first panel about bad faith engagement, because it's the type of argument which really doesn't hold any logic if you scrutinize it. And if you kind of hold it under a microscope. But it is the kind of argument which is a bit of a red flag, and it's the kind of thing that governments have found quite convenient to say in order to get away with the erosion of human rights, not only in this field, but also in other spaces. So the moment a government talks about national security implications, it becomes politically very difficult to challenge that argument. But which is why it's really important to try and break it down rationally and ask the simple question of why is it a national security risk for a mother to pass her citizenship on to her children and not for a father? And to make that a starting point to try and really push government representatives to be accountable. To UN agencies, to UN oversight mechanisms, but also to their own citizens. Because ultimately, these are laws which discriminate against the citizens of a country, who in most contexts are the true holders of sovereignty. So governments come and go, citizens stay. And the idea that a government can use and abuse its power to limit who a citizen is deeply problematic. So I have no real easy answer in terms of what can be done, because the national security argument is so kind of strong and people are so, I would say, quite irrational in how they respond or fail to respond the moment these words are thrown out. But I think it's again another reason why we need to be consistent and principled and strong in how we kind of call out such, I would say, bad faith arguments. Over to you, Bina.
Yeah, Okay, thank you. I'll try to be very quick, but we have this thing called myth busting. And so we actually do the myth busting for dual nationality and say it's also applicable to men, Malaysian men. And so, why is this, does this question only come to deprive women of citizenship, equal citizenship? And similarly, on that national security threat, they're only giving the citizenship to the child. There's no, I mean, in the Malaysian context, there's no way the father can be given citizenship if his child is Malaysian, or the foreign spouse of a Malaysian woman also does not have that access to citizenship. So there are no floodgates opening up, or there's no national security threat, because it's only a child's citizenship that you are actually according equal citizenship to. Yeah, so, okay, I think I'll stop there so that there may be other questions as well.
Thanks, Dina. I know there's so much that we could discuss about this, and I know we're getting close to time, and for those in our audience that need to leave, but maybe I'll pose just a couple more questions for the panelists if we take about 5 more minutes. So I want to turn this question to Subin, and this is from just, given your work on this issue in a number of different countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Adeline shares, I am an impacted mother of Malaysia's gender unequal citizenship laws. My son was stateless when he was born. He now has the right of abode to his father's country. However, our life is in Malaysia, and I've been struggling to obtain his Malaysian citizenship for almost a decade now. And Adeline, I'm so sorry for what you've been facing with your family. It is so unjust. So Adeline's question is, how can mothers like me give more effective testimonies, especially to the non-converted?
Firstly, I think, Adeline, I'm again very sorry that you're facing such a difficult situation right now. And like Catherine said, this is extremely unjust. But I mean, again, I'm not sure if I'm the best person to answer this, but still, I think considering the situation in many countries where there is gender discriminatory nationality law, I think many powerful testimonies can contribute to reforming laws or contribute to the national movements. I can maybe share a few examples of the work that I've done, maybe in Nepal, and some examples of other countries as well, especially maybe Nepal, where the mothers actually, they were the ones who led the campaign to to sort of advocate for equal nationality rights. And the campaign was designed in a way where it tried to sort of evoke the emotional aspect of the Nepali. I mean, Amal spoke about the national security argument, where that argument was sort of tackled by this argument of mothers sort of giving birth to the children and them not having the right to confer citizenship, and them not having the preliminary or the preferential right to confer their identity to their own children, especially in a country like Nepal, which has a huge maternal mortality rate. So the national security concerns or those arguments were sort of, in a way, trumped to a certain degree of success through these testimonies of the mothers. So I think there have been other examples as well in other countries as well, where the leadership of mothers or women have resulted in positive changes, where they have been able to in many ways counter arguments like that of national security, or the argument of sustenance of the economy, or putting or sort of the nationalist argument of protecting the certain ethnic identity. So yeah, I think I'll leave it to that. And like I said, maybe Bina or Melinda might have better answers to this, but I thought I would still share this.
Thanks, Subin. And so maybe I'm going to turn for the last 2 questions, and maybe Melinda, if you want to add anything to this, both for you, Karima, and then Melinda. So if you can just keep your responses short, since we are so short on time. Karima, I want to pose the question to you of, because Malini asked a very good question, and we see this in a number of countries with these discriminatory laws, gender discriminatory nationality laws, that they often occur in a number of countries that have high percentages of migrants living in society. So in a context like Malaysia, with a large migrant community, of course, in Lebanon, you also have a large number of displaced persons and migrants living in Lebanon. And this is something that has also come up, you know, in terms of those that fear reforms and kind of using the displaced population and migrants as scapegoats for not reforming the nationality law. So perhaps, Karima, you could just give a really quick response on how you have addressed this issue of the migrant and displaced communities, and kind of countering those arguments that that is a justification for not reforming the nationality law.
نعم.
Thank you, Catherine. This is a very important question. We always face it during our work with decision makers, and especially the people who oppose the reform. We classify people or decision makers with some people with the reforms and some people who are neutral, and there is some people who work so they don't reform the law. They always use these arguments, and especially the file of the displaced and migrants. Few years back, they were using Palestinian refugees. Well, but after the crisis in Syria, we have now the displaced issue. First thing we use, we don't go into a discussion in other files. So we separate these issues. Now, the women, the Lebanese women who are married to foreign nationals is a separate file. We cannot incorporate it with other files and other issues, especially that we are always advocating or talking about the nationality law. So we always uphold the constitution that says that every citizen, male or female, are equal before the law. That's why we are demanding the equality for women in conferring citizenship. So when we go to them, they always use the numbers like there are 1 million refugees, but simply we were answering that we are with human rights, we are with the rights, with the rights of refugees, but now here we are now to discuss the right of Lebanese women to confer the citizenship. Sorry, the line was cut.
All right.
Line is cut.
I think since the internet connection, thank you, Karima, for your response, and sorry that we're having those internet challenges. Just before we're closing out, I want to turn a final question to Melinda. And this question from the chat was asking, you know, given the different intersectional issues that you've brought up and taking that approach, for example, the links with gender-based violence, how have you used this in your international advocacy, in your UN-related advocacy? And just a quick response, if you don't mind.
Sure. I think I did give some examples of how we've utilized various different UN advocacy mechanisms when it comes to like intersectionality. But I guess in terms of how it helps enhance our advocacy, one of our biggest challenges was actually getting the message across beyond the regular network of people who we reach out to, those who may already be aware of the issue or are our supporters. So I think collaborating or I guess making that link and being able to speak to different organizations really helps to get the message across even more and reach wider audiences. For example, when we were looking at religion and discriminatory nationality laws, we were able to engage with an organization called ABIM nationally. And that helped us to actually tap into their audience and get the issue of nationality laws in a way that they would understand better. As well as when we're looking at gender-based violence, we were able to tap into the audiences of an organization called Stand Up My that regularly works on gender-based violence. So I guess this really helps us to look at gender discriminatory nationality laws as a multi-dimensional issue rather than a one-dimensional issue that interacts with so many different issues and identities. And it helps us to connect with more specific audiences and really garner public support beyond our usual network.
Thanks so much, Melinda. And I just really want to thank all of our amazing panelists, and thank you to our attendees for all of your active participation. The chat was going nonstop, and it's very clear that there's so much more conversation and sharing to be had around this issue. So we look forward to, hopefully all of you will participate in upcoming further discussions where we can take a deeper dive into some of these questions and sharing good practices for ending gender discrimination in nationality laws. And thanks to everyone for your patience with technical challenges, internet challenges. And I want to extend a special thanks to our interpreters, to our international sign interpreter, Natasha. You've been amazing, especially having to juggle all of this on your own. And Bashar, thank you so much for your excellent Arabic interpretation as well. So I want to close this, but of course the conversation continues. I hope you will continue to share your ideas and reflections around this discussion on social media. We were really excited to share our new civil society guide. And so welcome you to circulate that with your networks, and we'll be sharing that on social media shortly as well. So just a special thanks again to all of our amazing panelists and all of you for joining us in this conversation, and wishing you a good night, evening, afternoon, late morning for some of us, wherever you are. Thank you.